We will start. Before I will give a few words to the student, and then I pass
All right,
the word to you. All right?
good.
Ok, meus estudantes, nossos estudantes, aliás, nós estamos aqui retomando mais uma vez as conferências do professor Kellogg. Houve um pequeno ajuste em função de horários e outros problemas decorrentes, mas agora tudo está normalmente resolvido. Vocês terão até o fim aulas de 10h30 até 11h30, e hoje nós vamos passar agora a palavra ao professor Kellogg para a sua conferência de hoje. Muito obrigado. Ok, Kellogg, can you go?
Thank you. Good morning, and welcome to the 7th lecture on my topic of democracy and social conflict, how we govern ourselves between elections. We have been discussing John Dewey's pragmatism, his concern with social problems, and the question of human freedom, social freedom, our ability to control our own destiny. Dewey's thought was influenced by 19th century American pragmatists, and yet it was highly original, distinct from the major trends of the philosophy of his time, and he was both ignored and misunderstood. Dewey's pragmatism reflected a dynamic, changing view of the world rather than a static, immediate analysis. We are living within a world that is greatly subject to change, and we must recognize that fact. The world will change anyway, and we must see ourselves as inquirers and solvers, agents of change, not victims of it. Last time, we distinguished Dewey's view from utilitarianism, a venerable and still strong tradition of philosophy. And today, I will discuss the powerful influence of analytical moral philosophy as it developed during the last century. It has continued to dominate the academic world in this century. It grows out of questions that were related to utilitarianism, such as what is utility and the good that humans pursue, but it focuses instead on moral language, especially the terminology of goodness and the language of generalism and particularism. So how does morality work? Should we act according to general rules or particular considerations? To put this in historical perspective, I begin with a well-known dialogue from Plato. This conversation takes place on the steps of the courthouse in Athens. It is a debate between Plato's hero, Socrates, and a priestly man named Euthyphro, considered an authority on morals. Both men are preparing for hearings, and they're discussing a fundamental issue of right and wrong. Socrates was about to be tried for impiety, for corrupting the young with his constant questioning and his skepticism of claims to absolute truth. Euthyphro was about to prosecute his own father for starving to death one of his employees who himself had killed a slave. So we have here two particular cases raising a general question: how to justify a particular action. Socrates wants to justify his practice of skeptical questioning, and the priestly Euthyphro wants to justify prosecuting his father. These are two difficult and complicated cases, which makes them hard to decide. They're uncertain cases, not like failing to stop at a stop sign, your typical traffic case. There you have a clear rule posing a simple question: did you stop or not? Instead, we have two difficult cases. What should we do about such so-called hard cases, more complicated ones? The question is what philosophers call justification. The question of justifying them is stated by Socrates in a famous quotation. He asks how they would be viewed by the gods of Athens. He says to the priestly Euthyphro, "The point which I should wish to understand is whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved of the gods." In other words, are we looking for what is naturally right in some overarching sense, or just our human judgment, the best outcome as we see it? The gods here are presumably omniscient. Their opinion would be transcendent, right for all times and places. Translated into law, the question might be whether right is right by nature or by enactment or convention. How do we justify moral decisions, especially close ones, hard ones? Our legal system always seems to demand an explanation, but in 5,000 years, it has yet to come up with a convincing answer to the question of immediate justification. Plato's dialogue gets into a number of difficult issues. Socrates questions whether the gods would all agree on what is holy, and what if they do not? He questions whether the definition of holy has to do with justice. He questions whether it has to do with humanitarianism and the care of others. He raises the very questions about uncertainty that we started with in the very first lecture. But Socrates ends without any resolution. After a long debate in which Socrates challenges every possible answer, the priestly Euthyphro simply gives up and walks away. Socrates says, "Alas, my companion, will you leave me in despair?" Socrates' question about justification is still a great question, one of the greatest questions of our ethical tradition. It is the question of whether a difficult case or any particular action can be without an inherently right nature. The analytical tradition has really not advanced much farther than Plato 5,000 years ago, or perhaps I should say it has advanced the discussion, but not the answer. Utilitarianism doesn't get us there, nor does the more recent analytical concerns with moral language and discourse, which dominated the past century and obscured Dewey's insights. So what does Dewey's pragmatism have to say about this? We have been digging deeply into this difficult issue in order to get a clearer picture of pragmatism's position. The path to an answer lies in seeing that the difficult case can be part of a larger problem. Life is full of uncertainty, and it is not enough to walk away and leave us in despair. But when it comes to the difficult case, pragmatism asks a different question from Socrates. Rather than just asking how the gods would view this or that case, the uncertain case, pragmatism asks, is there a problem? A bigger one than just this difficult case? If so, where are we in the inquiry, the continuum of inquiry? Should this be seen as a smaller question within a larger question, the lowercase q as opposed to the capital letter Q? Consider the two cases in this dialogue. Socrates being prosecuted for impiety and Euthyphro's father prosecuted for homicide. If we consider the accusation against Socrates as part of a long continuum, we can conclude that his style of questioning has been entirely justified by human experience. In fact, it constitutes an important part of our education. All of the American law schools use what is called the Socratic Method. It's a method of questioning just like Socrates. And in the public sphere, there is a right to such questioning of sacred assumptions protected by our First Amendment to the Constitution. Also, a continuum has arguably affected the other case, the case of Euthyphro in the now well-developed law of justifiable homicide. So justifying the answer to a hard case has two aspects. First, the case has to be decided fairly, meaning all aspects must be fully considered. These reasons become part of the record, and we saw how reasons can be retired by further experience. And second, if the case suggests a new and larger problem, that should be left open. Socrates' question about the gods is premature. What kind of problem is the larger one? Freedom of speech or justifiable homicide? How should we define it? And how can these questions be addressed and resolved over the long term? If the ultimate question lies in solving the larger problem, then in Athenian terminology, the gods don't yet have an opinion. The act in question is not holy or unholy until the larger problem is resolved. Dewey's continuum of inquiry opens the door to issues of resolution. Today we examine it in more detail. We have problems and conflicts that don't always get addressed at the polls by elections. Instead, we have seen them get worse in a divided politics. The major problems of today challenge entrenched habits. Last time, we discussed three major problems confronting us today and causing conflict. Hostility to people on account of gender, preference, or physical condition, or bullying. Controlling the pandemic of COVID-19 with vaccination and masking. And taking vigorous steps to address the global climate crisis. Entrenched habits are under attack, and there is vigorous resistance. Conflict over these large problems and a multitude of smaller ones dominates our lives today. We saw that John Dewey's ethical approach is concerned with problems, while analytical moral theory is discussed in the abstract, often without regard to real and specific issues. It has been obsessed with how morals and ethics are discussed in general terms rather than how they develop over time. Dewey struggled to clarify his insights in the last century, but he was overwhelmed and drowned out by the narrow attitudes of analytical philosophers. They simply failed to understand him, even some that seemed to sympathize with his progressive approach to science and democracy. In Lecture 4, we discussed the scientist Hans Reichenbach, who defended the fact-value dichotomy, the idea that only scientific objects are real. Dewey's empirical naturalism struggled to show that moral experience was just as real. We also discussed the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, who ridiculed Dewey's conception of truth as warranted assertion, and he called it a taking of generalized wishful thinking as a definition of truth. Dewey's response was that Mr. Russell proceeds by converting a doubtful situation into a personal doubt. But I emphasize that Dewey's doubtful situation is a social situation. Yet Dewey failed to clarify how he saw that situation being resolved. He often looked at society organically, using biological comparisons. You might say he was trying to examine how normativity actually works, as if you could watch it like a doctor watches your blood through an ultrasound. I recently had an ultrasound on my blood circulation. The technician, with a handheld device, was able to see what was actually happening through a device that could send signals through my skin and show the result on a computer screen. Ultrasound technology came in a generation ago for examining unborn babies in their mother's womb. And now, with computer technology, it is able to examine all kinds of internal biological activities, like your heart and arteries and blood circulation. Where does Dewey's organic model lead us today? I'll compare it to ultrasound. Social conflict is essential, you might say, to the blood flow of society, to the circulation of its moral and ethical biology. It's not the only activity in society, but it's a very important one that we can see as if we were looking through an ultrasound at social ethics. By focusing on the dynamic aspect of social conflict, we can clear away the earlier confusion over what Dewey called empirical naturalism. Before modern technology like ultrasound, doctors were limited in the kinds of evidence available to them. They could study the bodies of deceased humans and animals, but without life, this was limited evidence of the dynamic process. In the prior lectures, we have seen that pragmatism provides a unique and distinct vision of the moral world. It is a dynamic vision, one that replaces the static one that dominates contemporary ethics. Unlike utilitarianism or consequentialism, pragmatism gives us an understanding of the relation of uncertainty to actual problems and how we respond to them. Utilitarianism would simply balance pleasure and pain, seeking the greatest good of the greatest number. But conflicts don't get resolved by immediate calculation. Utilitarianism doesn't address the reality of social uncertainty. Socrates makes this clear in the dialogue with Euthyphro. There is no agreement leading to resolution. Today we explore the problem of generalism and particularism and its relevance for ethics. We prepared the way for this by comparing Dewey's pragmatism to the long tradition of utilitarianism, the idea that morality consists of an assessment of the consequences of every human act. That is a form of particularism, but utilitarianism ran into the roadblock of the extensionalist challenge, which showed that it provides no support for general rules, for the obvious necessity of generalizing. It's an ideal theory, a perfectionist theory, overly abstract, and unrealistically a fixed model of society. Summing up the goodness of every act led to the first problem. It soon became obvious that the sum total of all acts in their production of happiness proves too much. Should a judge sentence an innocent man to death to quell a riot or stop a crime wave? If people explicitly adopted utilitarianism and tried to follow it, things might very well go worse, even as judged by a utilitarian, than if people adopted and tried to follow rules instead. In that case, the utilitarian will recommend adopting and trying to follow rules. That's rule utilitarianism. And it divided utilitarianism into act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. But when both sides tried to defend the very idea of consequentialism in moral theory, they ran into what we discussed last week as the problem of extensionalism. Extensionalism says that both of these views, act and rule utilitarianism, amount to the same result, because there are always exceptions to any rule. Actually, there are many exceptions to any rule that you can think of, whether it's don't lie or don't steal or what have you. For every situation where compliance with some rule would not produce the greatest expected good, rule consequentialism seems driven to favor instead compliance with some rule or some amended rule. But if rule consequentialism operates this way, then in practice, it ends up requiring the very same acts that act consequentialism requires. This leads to trouble for the very idea of utilitarianism as a moral balance. As I said last time, the rule-based order of society is of fundamental importance to survival and stability. Nothing will get done without it. There will be complete chaos and no problems will be solved. But exceptions to a rule are not known in advance and cannot be. They often lie in the space that I defined as social uncertainty. So the extensionalist challenge reveals an enormous weakness and failure when compared to pragmatism. Both Kenneth Arrow and Friedrich Hayek saw that society cannot work out conflict through a calculus. Instead, we often manage conflict by redefining or replacing the very terms and forms of calculation in disputed problems. Every particular dispute is stuck in its context over opposing reasons, what philosophers call incommensurable reasons, reasons that can't be measured together, reasons that are utterly inconsistent. How does civilization survive constant conflict? Why, it requires the retirement of these incommensurable reasons, not the forcing of choices among them. So where do rules in fact come from? How are they justified? How does the normative order achieve both justification and stability? Here we arrive at the underlying problem of generalism, which argues that moral and ethical justification lies in general dictates because they have essential qualities, justifying particular judgments. But a recent group of philosophers calling themselves particularists say no to this view. They have shaken up analytical ethics with arguments that I want to explore today in detail in order to develop our answer to Socrates. We have two reasons for focusing on this issue. One is to more clearly distinguish Dewey's pragmatism from utilitarianism and from analytical philosophy. The other is to clarify and define pragmatism, and frankly, to admonish and dispute many contemporary pragmatists for failing to fully comprehend John Dewey's contribution, especially his transformative continuum of normative inquiry. Many scholars, including contemporary scholars who identify as pragmatists, have actually failed to distinguish Dewey from the path of modern moral philosophy. Such is the domination of analytical thinking. For example, the author of the essay on American moral philosophy, American moral theory, rather, in the recent Oxford Handbook of American Philosophy, is a man named Brad Hooker. You would think that a current handbook of American philosophy would include Dewey's unique contribution to ethical theory. But the editor of this handbook identifies as a pragmatist, and her choice of authors to write this chapter on American moral theory is most definitely not one. He has an impressive command of contemporary moral theory, but pragmatism gets faint attention and is mentioned summarily with little account of Dewey's moral theory. The chapter on American moral theory begins with a summary listing of Dewey's works, and then the author says, Dewey's interest in human psychology, his hostility to dogmatism, and his commitment to instrumentalism and experimentalism were deeply influential in American thought in general and moral and social philosophy in particular. But rather than elucidating that influence, he dismisses Dewey with the comment, the giants of America, of early 20th century moral philosophy were British, not American. Of Dewey, he concludes that his naturalism and experimentalism was overridden by non-naturalism in moral metaphysics and foundationalist intuitionism in moral epistemology. So what is the author referring to? To a line of thought that continues static analytical moral thinking beyond utilitarianism. The author fails to explain where pragmatism might fit into the contemporary conversation, which is why we need to do that today. He adopts instead the tradition of analytical theory as it has developed from what we call the emotivism of two of the more famous analytical authors, A.J. Ayer, in his book, Language, Truth, and Logic, and C.L. Stevenson in Ethics and Language. You should remember that emotivism grew out of the fact-value dichotomy, but it is developed by Ayer and Stevenson into a question of language and its use and meaning. After the dominance of utilitarianism in the 19th century, analytical theory became obsessed with language. Englishman G.E. Moore began in his book, Principia Ethica, which is Latin for principles of ethics, was instrumental in this turn to language. He began by focusing on one of the principal abstractions in ethical theory, the meaning of the word good. Moore accused John Stuart Mill of the naturalistic fallacy, or confusing moral language with factual language. If you haven't heard of the naturalistic fallacy, it's a very well-known issue. It follows from the fact-value distinction that where Dewey disagreed with that scientist named Hans Reichenbach. So this led to the idea that moral language is unrelated to fact, and it's just the expression of human feeling or emotion. This so-called emotivism thereby ushered in the age of modern analytical ethics. The focus of emotivism on moral and ethical language has led to the current debates over principled generalism and particularism, which often resort to hypothetical ethical dilemmas, like the famous runaway trolley that will kill 5 workmen unless diverted to another track where it will kill only 1. Dewey was misunderstood. He had a strong practical purpose in explaining his own meaning of moral language, and he defined it in practical terms. But his meaning was completely misunderstood by Stevenson in that book, Ethics and Language, which was very influential. And it was therefore misunderstood by others who were influenced by Stevenson. And this was a failure to fully comprehend Dewey's enormous volume of writing, Dewey's focus on the practical. Indeed, the very term pragmatic was easily misread as an immediate apprehension of practicality instead of referring to a continuing and potentially transformative inquiry. Moral theory still ignores Dewey even today. This results in pragmatism itself being ignored by mainstream philosophers. Pragmatists really have themselves to blame for being left out of the analytical conversation. Any handbook of American philosophy should show how they respond to emotivism. They have failed to meet analytical theory head-on, to address normative problems like the trolley dilemma in a fully naturalist and experimentalist vein, and to tackle the static, synchronic, analytical account of normative logic for its unrealistic representation of actual moral experience. Instead, they allow a tendency today to see pragmatism within the analytical tradition. The rise of ethical particularism is actually an opportunity. Now, it is technical stuff, but important enough that we need to explore it in detail. I'll introduce you to some technical terms that may be hard to follow, but I try to put them in a context that you can review and understand. This new rivalry of moral particularism and generalism is an important event in the conversation over pragmatism. I believe that the rivalry will prove unsustainable and open up space for pragmatist viewpoints. It is an argument that simply has no resolution because it fails to work like an ultrasound. It fails to see beyond the fixed evidence and static terminology of moral language. Particularism focuses on specifics and facts, while generalism focuses on abstractions and conclusions. How do they relate to each other? Is truth to be found in general principles rather than specifics of experience? If not, do we fall into relativism? The famous trolley problem ignores an aspect of vital importance for real dilemmas, which are born of the actual conflicts in society. Remember, the key to pragmatism's response to analytical moral theory is found in Dewey's continuum of normative inquiry. Viewed as part of an experimental continuum, particularism and generalism are stages of inquiry into real, not imaginary, moral dilemmas, which analytical theory tends to conflate in its static vision of ethical inquiry. The trolley problem explores the intuitive role of intention in moral rules, and pragmatism actually explores the origin and source of intention. A real dilemma was the prosecution of Dr. Jack Kevorkian for providing a terminal patient with a suicide device. His intent was not to murder the patient, but to provide a new context, a new space for considering the patient's own genuine intention. Ironically, the vast trolley literature and the recent interest in ethical particularism are actually helpful here in revealing the importance of the insight of Dewey's continuum of inquiry. Real moral dilemmas represent actual conflicts that cannot be understood through the analysis of cleverly constructed moral puzzles. Repeated over time, real problems drive the consensual formation and revision of social practices and the expression, or what philosophers call predication, putting into sentences, of general moral rules and principles. The real continuum of normative inquiry is unrecognized in the analysis of hypothetical dilemmas, like the trolley problem, where the natural context of a problematic continuum is entirely removed. It's only through actual normative engagement, such as we studied in law in the second lecture, that the continuum is clearly on display. Remember the stages of inquiry. Early in the continuum, as new conflicts are presented for judgment, opposing reasons are unprioritized. But over time, they're gradually compared through comparative reasoning from experience as generalization emerges with practical use, eventually fixed through adaptive practice. The eventual body of moral knowledge is therefore a mixture of settled and unsettled inquiry. It's like a pattern fabric of tentative as well as entrenched propositional domains, that is to say, sentences that are agreed to. In this regard, it presents a pluralist ontology. Ontology is the philosophical term for the study of what exists. Remember the picture that we envisioned from Nancy Cartwright, the dappled world of scientific knowledge that applies also to normative or moral knowledge. Ethical particularism says that the evaluative cannot be cashed out in propositional form, and that it is descriptively shapeless. Cashing out refers to predication, to putting it into sentences, to shaping it with words. How does morality get shaped with words? Here, I think the pragmatist response should be that the areas of uncertainty are shapeless, while areas of stability can be described as shaped. Think about hard cases like those in Plato's dialogue. They may be viewed as encountering a shapeless particularist context of seemingly unlimited reasons that Socrates explores with his questioning. Particularists have been calling those reasons non-moral properties. Normativity is actually driven by repetition of similar situations toward shared practices and consensus among those descriptive predication, to use the philosophical jargon. Rather than retention of epistemic status, that is to say, retention of their hard existence by defeated reasoning, this illustrates retirement of relevant properties and accompanying reasons, and transformation of the reason's environment, again using jargon, a pluralist normative ontology. This is the dappled world of uncertainties mixed with certainties. The particularist philosopher named Margaret Little describes particularism as follows, quote, "There is no way of cashing out propositionally the ways in which non-evaluative properties contribute to the evaluative natures of situations, actions, characters. The particularist's claim is that the good-making relation cannot be cashed out in propositional form." What does cashing out propositionally mean? It means putting a thought into a sentence with subject-object form. But if this characterization by Margaret Little of particularism, moral particularism, is correct, and if the statement were true, how would moral knowledge be communicatable? How would it motivate anybody? How would moral knowledge be possible? Again, we must work through uncertainty. Moral particularism emphasizes the multiplicity and variety of reasons for a particular ethical decision, reasons that can, quote, shift polarity from case to case. What do we mean by that? We'll talk about that. But particularism calls this reason's holism, or the context sensitivity of relevant non-moral or factual properties. During the period before modern medical technology, there were many explanations of illness that were based on static evidence of human bodies. Reason's holism is an analogous method of explanation from immediate, static, still life evidence of language. According to the holism of reasons, the list of, quote, non-moral properties is very long. And a consideration that is a reason in one context may not similarly be a reason in another due to differences in the presence or absence of defeating or enabling conditions. This holism of reasons is claimed as an essential feature of all ethical choice. Particularism is one side of the debate, and the other side is generalism. Particularism is a reaction against a form of generalism that claims a limited set of reasons can dictate the same result. Richard Hare's doctrine in moral thinking of universalizability holds that when a particular action is judged morally wrong, this is so on account of a discrete set of properties. Consistency demands that any action that shares these properties is also wrong. He says universalizability comes to this, that if we make different moral judgments about situations which we admit to be identical in their universal descriptive properties, we contradict ourselves. It follows from universalizability that if I now say that I ought to do a certain thing to a certain person, I am committed to the view that the very same thing ought to be done to me were I in exactly that situation. Plato asks the same question in the dialogue between Socrates and the priestly Euthyphro. Socrates asks, is not the holy always one and the same thing in every action? And is not the unholy always opposite to the holy and like itself? And as unholiness, does it not always have one essential form, which will be found in everything that is unholy? That's Socrates. Richard Hare considers relevant properties of acts of all kinds, from parking lots to playing games. But the ethical particularists have consistently contended that the generalist list of relevant properties required to support universalization can't be limited. An early example of this holist dimension of reasons was Philippa Foot's snake example. She noted in 1983 that it is dangerous to pick up a snake, but it may be more dangerous not to pick up this particular one. The particularist Jonathan Dance comments, quote, "The dangerousness of not picking up this snake is not reduced by the dangerousness of picking it up, of not picking it up or picking it up." And he claims this demonstration of a variable valence of factual properties shows that the opposing reason retains its full force. This is a subtle point made by particularism, which I won't belabor here, but rather I'll go on to rebut it. The point is that the problem is one of immediate perception, and it is settled by John Dewey's continuum of normative inquiry. Just consider the example of picking up of the snake example in the context of circus snake charmers who regularly gather venomous snakes for training and feeding. At first, it is equally dangerous to pick up a snake or not to, but through repeated experience, a practice is established in which the parity of opposing valences or opposing reasons is retired. The practice develops when the situation is repeated sufficiently to become a common problem. Circus snake performers will adopt from experience strict rules that govern when and how snakes are to be picked up. The equal dangers of picking up or not are removed by the practice. It is no longer then the case that, quote, the defeated non-comparative ought can remain true. I realize that's jargon, but I need to bring you into this jargonic issue. The example suggests the existence of occasions in which retired reasons do not retain their full force in defeat. But note, in this context, retirement of reasons in the snake case takes place within a discrete community. That's why I use the case of entering a traffic circle before any rule regarding rights of way. The rules of the road have derived from an entire community in a fashion comparable to the snake charmer's practice, from necessity, driven by experience, by practices emerging from the experience of potential injury. In an early particularist world, there was no settled rule for when and how drivers first entered what might have been that first English traffic circle or roundabout. This is a world that was pre-predicative, before description, before propositions with regard to traffic circles, what the particularists call the holism of reasons is an initial condition. The list of relevant properties governing normative conduct can be shown to be initially very long. The legal process is constantly winnowing out those reasons, like the imaginary lawyer representing the driver I called Mrs. Quickly, who was struck by a truck when she dashed into the early roundabout. Damage and injury resulted with no governing rule, and the two drivers could argue anything regarding justice or rightness. But once the rule establishing a presumptive right-of-way for any vehicle already in the roundabout has taken hold, none of this is relevant. The driver's action and the class of all similar actions is now clearly predicable as wrong, stateable as wrong, and a judicial decision in her favor would be considered unjust. And the various reasons that Mrs. Quickly might entertain to justify her haste in entering the already occupied traffic circle, such as her being late to church or whatever, they're discounted by the combination of the rule and the established practice governing other drivers and their expectations that she will not enter the roundabout or the traffic circle in such a manner as to require their emergency action. The ethical general derives motivational force from the entrenched rule and practice and will override the individual reasons that she or other drivers may yet entertain about their own priorities. So predication, that is to say, statement, proposition, language, comes as a later stage as the wrong or the bad is related to its own experience. This elucidates the philosopher Margaret Little's observation that the good-making relation cannot be cashed out in propositional form. That she says the thin moral properties of good or bad, right or wrong, are revealed as resultant properties. They originate independently of the properties from which they result. How and why did the traffic circle rule come about? A solution just had to be found in order to stop crashes in the traffic circle from continuing unabated. In the early or novel legal case, just as in any individual act, there are aggravating and mitigating factors everywhere you look on both sides. And moral particularism does not accept restrictive rules of evidence. The properties available as reasons and as arguments are narrowed by the emergence of cautionary practices. And the process of normative induction, which I call normative induction, is the process of logical induction through time. It compares them in a gradual rather than immediate process. David Hume wrote, "When we have found a resemblance among several objects that often occur to us, we apply the same name to all of them, whatever differences we may observe in the degrees of their quantity and quality. Normative generalism, we might observe, is a product of establishing a commitment to finite and nameable expectations." This is not to deny the value of particularist dilemmas. The famous Trolley Problem has demonstrated the variable valence of individual intentional states. And that is why I compare the real dilemma of Dr. Kevorkian, convicted of a second-degree murder for his device for a patient who pushed a button, releasing fatal chemicals. Kevorkian placed himself in the trolley position of tragic choice among alternative destinies. His case was initially unique, but it opened up the problem, which has demonstrated sufficient repeated practical similarity for inductive comparison in the way in which I described David Hume, inductive comparison of differences and similarities, and then predication or proposition or statement, such that relevant properties have been subject to the process of inquiry over time. Now, recall the dapple world that I emphasized. What is missing from the particularist account is the pervasiveness of adjusted practices, which populates the landscape of reasons, supporting their perception of what is salient or not. One particularist observes that some of the properties of a situation that are relevant to the question of what one should do, and some are not. These relevant properties are salient. They stick out or obtrude or should catch our attention. When moral decisions are explained, salience is the critical measure. When we come to give a description of the situation, the various saliences make a difference to how we should go about it. And he says the father who tells his child not to take the flowers from the next door garden because that would be stealing should not be seen as subsuming this action under the general principle stealing is wrong, but rather as pointing to the most salient feature of the situation. So salience really consists in the acceptance of already existing patterns of normative practice and induction. In coming on a roundabout, dominating the holism of reasons would be the rule and practice of yielding to traffic already there. So particularism gets confused about this dappled world. It assumes that there is no such dappled world of certainty and uncertainty. And it accepts the patterns of normative induction without recognizing that they have themselves already emerged from a stage of indeterminate particularism. So that, as you can see, they are conflating the realities of inquiry over time as a simple way of explaining moral and ethical theory. So the landscape, you might call it, the landscape of normatively derived patterns, it's pluralistic, and it's not well suited to a universal description supporting the particularist observation of cashing out the good-making relationship. So holistic particularism rests on a classification error, that of considering the individual dilemma as typical of all moral experience. Particularism has challenged the very notion of similarity or identicality in real normative life. In conventional explanations of the inductive process, similarity among objects of inquiry is commonly presumed. Hume's remark, when we have found resemblance among several objects, we apply the same name to all of them, whatever differences we may observe in the degrees of their quantity and quality, and whatever other differences may appear among them. This implies that an important part of the inductive process is finding similarity. So the question to be addressed is whether and how similarity among normatively defined situations comes to be recognized and named. So you see why I use that analogy of the ultrasound. The ultrasound is an analogy for our trying to look behind the landscape of reasons, the landscape of moral language right now, to understand how it has come to be in place and how it is in the course of changing according to the flow and circulation of social problems. And that is my lecture for today.
Okay, Fred, thank you very much for your beautiful speaking. And we will turn next week at the same time. All right?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, George.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.